There is a kind of leaving that makes no sound, no slammed doors, no final argument that echoes down the hallway, no tearful confession at the end of a long night. Just a gradual, almost invisible withdrawal, like the tide pulling back from the shore so slowly that no one notices until the sand is completely bare. This is the kind of leaving that most people never truly understand, because by the time it happens, the one who is leaving has already been gone for a very long time. Most people imagine that when something ends, there is a moment, a turning point, a single sentence that broke everything, a specific afternoon where the damage became irreversible. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes there is a moment so sharp, so final, that everything before and after it is divided clearly. But for the people who leave quietly, the ones who loved deeply and gave generously and stayed far longer than anyone would have expected, there is rarely a single moment. There is instead a slow accumulation of moments, a collection of small hurts that were never addressed, a series of conversations that ended the same way they always did, a pattern that repeated itself so many times that eventually the person stopped expecting anything different. This kind of leaving is built not from one great wound, but from 1,000 small ones. A comment that landed wrong and was never acknowledged, a moment of vulnerability that was met with distraction or dismissal, a need that was expressed clearly and honestly and then quietly ignored. These things do not break a person all at once. They wear a person down. They sand away at the edges of hope until hope becomes something thin and fragile and hard to hold on to. And the person on the inside, the one doing the hoping, the one doing the waiting, they often don't even realize how much has been eroded until they reach for that hope one day and find almost nothing left. What makes this especially painful is that people who leave quietly are almost never people who stopped trying. Quite the opposite. The ones who disappear without warning, the ones who become distant without explanation, the ones who one day simply are no longer present in the way they used to be. These are often the people who tried the hardest. They are the ones who stayed up late thinking of ways to fix things, the ones who rehearsed difficult conversations in their heads, trying to find exactly the right words that might finally be heard. The ones who gave second chances not out of weakness, but out of genuine belief that things could be different, that the person they loved was capable of meeting them halfway if only they could find the right way to ask. They lowered their expectations slowly, not because they lost their standards, but because they were willing to sacrifice pieces of what they wanted in order to preserve what they had. They told themselves that no relationship is perfect, that everyone goes through difficult seasons, that love requires patience and compromise and the willingness to stay even when staying is hard. And they believed these things, deeply and sincerely, because they were the kind of people who took commitment seriously. They were the kind of people for whom love was not a feeling that came and went, but a choice that they made again and again, even when the choice was costly. But there is a limit to how many times a person can make that choice without anything changing. There is a limit to how long someone can keep offering themselves fully and openly without receiving anything real in return. And the terrible irony is that the people who are most capable of enduring, the ones with the deepest wells of patience and the strongest capacity for forgiveness, are often the ones who suffer the longest before they finally reach that limit. They stay through things that others would have walked away from immediately. They absorb pain that others would have refused to carry. And because they are so good at enduring, the people around them sometimes never realize how much has been accumulating. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over someone who has begun to give up, but hasn't yet left. It is not the comfortable silence of two people who are so close they don't need words. It is not the peaceful silence of a quiet evening together. It is the silence of someone who has run out of things to say, not because nothing matters to them anymore, but because they have said the things that matter so many times in so many ways, and nothing has changed. This silence is a kind of surrender, not to the other person but to the reality that explaining further will not help, that more words will not fix what words have already failed to fix. People who have never experienced this kind of silence sometimes misread it completely. They see the quiet and assume everything is fine. They interpret the lack of argument as the absence of conflict. They mistake the stillness for peace. And so they continue living inside the relationship as though nothing has changed, not realizing that the person beside them has already begun the long, painful process of letting go. The arguments have stopped, yes, but not because the problems were resolved. Because the person who cared enough to argue has slowly, quietly, stopped believing that resolution is possible. There is something particularly devastating about watching a relationship from the inside as it begins to hollow out. Because even as the distance grows, the love does not necessarily disappear immediately. A person can still love someone and know, at the same time, that continuing is no longer sustainable. They can grieve what the relationship once was, or what they always hoped it might become, while also accepting with quiet clarity that it will never be those things. This is a grief that happens in private. It happens in the middle of ordinary days, while washing dishes or driving to work or lying in the dark unable to sleep. It is not dramatic, no one sees it, but it is real, and it is heavy, and it changes something fundamental in the person who carries it. By the time someone who loves this way finally makes the decision to leave, they have usually already said goodbye many times in their heart. They have already had the conversations that the other person will never hear. They have already mourned the version of things they once hoped for. They have already sat with the grief long enough that it no longer overwhelms them. This is why when they finally go, it can look so sudden and so calm to the people around them. From the outside, it seems like a decision made without enough thought or without enough feeling. But from the inside, it is the last step of a journey that has been happening for a very long time. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people who are left behind feel a kind of shock that quickly turns to anger. How could they just leave like that, without a warning, without a fight, without giving things one more chance? The anger is understandable. Grief takes many forms, but the truth is that the chances were given. The warnings were issued, quietly and repeatedly, in the form of conversations that were dismissed, in the form of needs that went unmet, in the form of a silence that should have been read as a signal but wasn't. The leaving only looks sudden to the person who was not paying attention. This is not said to assign blame, because it is also true that people are often simply not equipped to see what they are not looking for. It is possible to be inside a relationship and genuinely not understand the depth of what another person is experiencing. It is possible to think things are fine when they are not. It is possible to miss signals, not out of cruelty, but out of the kind of blindness that comes from being too comfortable, too distracted, or too afraid to look directly at what is happening. Human beings are complicated and imperfect, and relationships are the place where those complications and imperfections meet each other most directly. But understanding why something happened does not make it hurt less. And for the person who finally chose to leave after so many years of choosing to stay, the pain they carry out the door with them is real and legitimate, and often underestimated, because when someone invests that deeply in something and it still doesn't work, there is a particular quality of exhaustion that follows. Not just tiredness, not just sadness, but a kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from having tried so hard for so long and arrived at a place that feels so far from where they started. That exhaustion is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it is often misunderstood. People sometimes assume that the one who left is the one who got out, the one who is free, the one who has moved on. And there is a freedom in leaving. That is true. There is relief that comes when the weight of a situation that no longer serves you is finally set down. But freedom and peace are not the same thing. Relief and healing are not the same thing. The person who leaves quietly carries something with them, a complicated mix of grief and relief, of love that still lingers and certainty that going was the right choice. These things do not untangle themselves easily or quickly. The healing, when it comes, often looks different from what people expect. It is not a sudden return to joy. It is not a clean line between pain and recovery. It is quieter than that. It comes in small moments of realizing that the heaviness has lifted slightly, in the discovery of a piece that had been missing for a long time, in the gradual remembering of who you were before you spent so long trying to make something work that was not working. There is something sacred in that process of returning to yourself, something that takes time and gentleness and the willingness to stop measuring your worth by whether someone else was able to recognize it. Because that is often what the deepest hurt leaves behind, not just the loss of the relationship, but a quiet question that lodges itself somewhere in the chest. Was there something wrong with me? Did I ask for too much? Was I too much or not enough? These questions are painful, and they are also almost always based on a distortion. The fact that someone could not meet you where you were does not mean where you were was unreasonable. The fact that your needs went unmet does not mean your needs were excessive. It means there was a mismatch. It means something important was missing. It means the relationship, however much love existed within it, was not capable of sustaining what both people deserved. And if there is any wisdom worth carrying out of this kind of experience, it might be this. The willingness to stay and try and hope and endure is a beautiful quality in a person. It speaks to their depth and the loyalty and the seriousness with which they approach the people they love. But that same willingness can become something that works against a person if it is not paired with the discernment to recognize when the trying has become something one-sided, when the hoping has stopped being realistic, when the enduring has become simple suffering without progress. There is a difference between patience and self-abandonment. There is a difference between commitment and the refusal to acknowledge what is clearly not working. Learning to see that difference and to act on what you see is one of the harder and more important things a person can teach themselves. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to admit that something you love is not good for you. It requires the willingness to grieve what you wished something could be, rather than continuing to pour yourself into the gap between what it is and what you need it to be. That grief is real. That letting go is genuinely hard. But on the other side of it, there is something that the enduring and the trying and the staying could never give: a quiet sense of being at peace with yourself, and the possibility of building something in which you don't have to keep choosing to stay. If any of this has settled somewhere inside you, if you have recognized something of your own story in these words, then perhaps there is something worth asking yourself, not as a judgment, but as a gentle inquiry. How long have you been quiet about something that matters? How long have you been carrying something that was meant to be shared? How many times have you explained something important only to feel like the words disappeared the moment they left your mouth? There is no prescription here, no instruction telling you what to do next, but there is an invitation to take your own experience seriously, to trust your own perception of what you have been living through, and to remember that the things you have carried in silence still deserve to be witnessed, even if only by yourself. Sometimes the first act of healing is simply the willingness to look honestly at what has happened, to stop softening the edges of it, to stop explaining it away or minimizing it or insisting it wasn't as hard as it felt. It was as hard as it felt. The things that wore you down were real. The hope that kept you going was real. The grief that followed when that hope ran out was real. All of it counts. All of it matters. And if you have been doubting yourself, if you have been wondering whether your feelings were proportionate, or your needs were reasonable, or your choice, whatever it was justified, then maybe what is worth saying clearly is this: the love you gave deserved to be met. The effort you made deserved to be matched. The version of you that kept trying, kept hoping, kept showing up long after it would have been easier to walk away, that person did nothing wrong. And whatever comes next, whether you are still in the middle of something difficult, or you have recently reached the end of something, or you are somewhere in the long and quiet space that comes after, there is a possibility that you are closer to peace than you realize, not because the pain is over, not because the questions have been answered, but because the fact that you are still here, still thinking, still listening, still searching for words that might make sense of what you have been through, that says something important. It says that, even after everything, something in you is still reaching toward understanding, still reaching toward a version of yourself and a version of life that holds more room for peace than pain. That reaching is not small. It is in fact the beginning of everything.